Good morning, my dear students. This is Somasudari, Social Department. Today we are discussing about History Unit 4. The topic is Cold War. Before starting the class, I will ask few questions from previous topic. Are you ready? Okay, let's start. Question number 1. Shanghai Sheikh was capturing Peking in dash. Shanghai Sheikh was capturing Peking in dash. Answer is 1928. 1928. Question number 2. The Long March in dash. The Long March in dash. Answer is 1934. 1934. Question number 3. Who was born in Hunan in southeast China? Who was born in Hunan in southeast China? Answer is Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong. Question number 4. Who was father of modern China? Who was known as father of modern China? Answer is Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Dr. Sun Yat-sen. The Manchu, the ruling dynasty, had governed China since about dash. The Manchu, the ruling dynasty, had governed China since about dash. The answer is 1650. 1650. I hope you are all got correct answer, isn't it? Well done. Now we are going to today's topic, Cold War.
July 17, 1945. As World War II comes to an end, U.S. President Harry Truman, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin meet in Potsdam to decide the fate of Europe. The talks are marked by ideological and geopolitical disputes between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. Finally, agreements are reached to divide defeated Germany into zones of occupation. The leaders shake hands in a show of solidarity. But soon the Soviet Union and the Western powers find themselves bitter enemies in a dangerous worldwide confrontation known as the Cold War, that over the next 4 decades threatens to become a hot war, resulting in nuclear annihilation. Each side of this conflict believes that the survival of their respective economic and political systems is at stake. The Soviets are convinced that America intends to destroy communism, potentially through the use of atomic weapons. Americans fear that the spread of communism threatens their freedom and way of life with a system of government based on terror, oppression, and loss of individual liberty. In the years after the end of World War II, Stalin engineers elections in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and a coup in Czechoslovakia designed to bring communist governments to power. By 1948, the Soviet Union effectively controls all of Eastern Europe, and within another year, communists control mainland China. In June 1948, Stalin orders a blockade of Allied-controlled West Berlin. No food or fuel will enter the city from the surrounding Soviet territories. The Western Allies begin a daring airlift to supply the city. 11 months later, Stalin backs down and ends the blockade. The United States, Canada, and 10 European nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty on April 4, 1949, creating a collective security arrangement that they see as a deterrent to Soviet aggression. But without a military commander, NATO remains only a weak political alliance. Then, on August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tests an atomic bomb, obliterating America's sense of security. The United States' nuclear monopoly has been the only assurance against the Soviet Union's conventional military superiority. Suddenly, the US and its allies are left with little to prevent a Soviet advance in Western Europe. In June 1950, a new war erupts in Korea, putting the rest of the free world at risk. Western nations know they are too weak to prevent Stalin from swallowing up the rest of Europe in the same way. American and European leaders turned to General Dwight D. Eisenhower to provide leadership as the first supreme commander of NATO. For the first time, a collective military force will be assembled not to wage war, but to keep peace for the duration of the Cold War.
Cold War, a rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. The rivalry that developed after World War II between the US and the USSR and their respective allies created tension, which is referred as Cold War. They did not take recourse to weapons. Instead, they waged war on political, economic, and ideological fronts. Truman's policy of containment of communism. In 1948, the Soviets had established socialist government in the countries to Eastern Europe that had been liberated from the Nazis by the Soviet army. Truman, the president of USA, pursued a policy of containment of communism. The Soviets were, however, determined not only to maintain control of Eastern Europe but also keen on spreading communism worldwide. Next, Marshall Plan. The US conceived the Marshall Plan to bring the countries in Western Europe under its influence. The plan sought to help the countries of Europe with American dollars to facilitate their early recovery from the destruction caused by the Second World War. The United States was much concerned that poverty, unemployment, and dislocation caused by the post-World War II period were increasing the appeal of communist parties in Western Europe. The Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, advanced the idea of a European self-help program to be financed by the United States. 16 nations became part of the program. Administrative and technical assistance was offered through the Economic Cooperation Administration of the United States. Marshall Plan founding ended in 1951.
We have given much aid to the impoverished peoples of Europe on simple humanitarian grounds. But as a countermeasure against the attempt by the Soviet Union to communize Europe, the American people saw the necessity for cooperating with the non-communist countries in a comprehensive bipartisan European recovery program passed by Congress and here being signed by President Truman. This program, known also as the Marshall Plan, is designed to afford eligible nations that margin of help in credit and materials which they need to bring their overall economy back to health. Secretary of State Marshall, in placing the plan before Congress, stated,
"Why must the United States carry so great a load in helping Europe? The answer is simple. The United States is the only country in the world today which has the economic power and productivity to furnish the needed assistance. The 6 8/10 billion proposed for the first 15 months is less than a single month's charge of the war. To be quite clear, this unprecedented endeavor of the new world to help the old is neither sure nor easy. It is a calculated risk. It is a difficult program. And you know far better than I do the political difficulties involved in this program. But there's no doubt whatever in my mind that if we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully. And there's also no doubt in my mind that the whole world hangs in the balance as to what it is to be.
Next, I'll explain formation of military alliances. First, NATO. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The United States and its European allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to resist Soviet aggression in Europe 1949. It was an interstate military alliance between the countries of North America and Europe. The major member countries included Canada, Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. Later, Greece and Turkey joined the organization in 1952. Germany joined in NATO in 1955. The chief objective of NATO was the peace and security in the North Atlantic region. Next, SEATO or Manila Pact 1954. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was organized for the collective security of countries in Southeast Asia. Following the signing of the Manila Pact by the US, France, England, New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan, member countries of SEATO was committed to prevent communism from gaining ground in the region. Unlike the NATO alliance, SEATO had no joint commands with standing forces. Warsaw Pact. As a counter of the NATO, Soviet Union organized the Soviet bloc countries for a united military action under the Warsaw Pact. In December 1954, a conference of 8 European nations, namely Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland, Romania, and Russia, took place in Moscow. They concluded the treaty on May 14, 1955. This is known as the Warsaw Pact. A joint command of armed forces of the member countries with its headquarters in Moscow was set up. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved in 1991 following the breakup of USSR.
At the end of the Second World War, and emerging from nearly 4 decades of brutal Japanese occupation, the Korean peninsula found itself torn between two foreign ideologies, from the Soviet Union and the United States. Following Japan's defeat in 1945, the Soviet Union occupied the communist wing of the Korean resistance, all of the land north of the 38th parallel, while the United States occupied Korea south of the line. The Communist North was equipped with over 200,000 armed veterans who fought alongside Mao Zedong's Chinese Red Army against the Japanese, and then against Chiang Kai-shek in China's own bloody civil war. Their leader was Kim Il-sung, who saw the United States appointing former Japanese collaborators to top leadership positions in the South. His intent was to unite Korea under one communist ideology. By contrast, the unstable South was ill-equipped to defend itself compared to the battle-seasoned and well-supplied North. From 1945 to 1950, the South, under the leadership of Syngman Rhee, suffered massive civil unrest, often dealing with popular demonstrations with violent police retaliation, employing tactics reminiscent of the Japanese occupation. Following years of cross-border raids and skirmishing along the 38th parallel, Kim Il-sung invaded the South on June 25, 1950, behind a barrage of artillery fire. Syngman Rhee was forced to flee Seoul 2 days later. On the third day of fighting, the South bombed the bridge crossing the Han River and were in full retreat from the North's advance. On the day of the invasion in 1950, the United Nations Security Council in New York roundly condemned North Korea's action, with veto-wielding Russia infamously absent from the session. 2 days later, Security Council Resolution 83 was passed, recommending UN member states assist South Korea militarily. And with that, American President Harry Truman ordered the US Navy and Air Force, based mostly in Japan at the time, into action on behalf of the South. Less than 2 months since the invasion began, Kim Il-sung had driven the South Korean and US forces to Pusan in the southeast corner of the peninsula and was expecting an imminent and total victory in the war. At the time, China decided to position more than 250,000 of its troops along its Korean border, should the conflict escalate and the North's advance be repelled. After weeks of fighting around Pusan, the US had significantly reinforced the South, while American bombers degraded the supply lines and troop strength of the North. The army of Kim Il-sung was forced to retreat. Only 25,000 North Korean soldiers ever managed to rejoin their northern ranks. The South's counterattack successfully pushed across the 38th parallel and, along with US forces, captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. In response, China ordered its troops to cross into North Korea and repel the South Korean counteroffensive on October 25, 1950. Following 2 months of brutally contested warfare, US and South Korean forces were expelled from North Korea back across the 38th parallel. By January 4, 1951, North Korea had captured Seoul for a second time. However, as before following its invasion of the South in June 1950, North Korea lacked the logistical support to supply any further pursuit of the South. This gave US and South Korean troops time to quickly regroup, rearm, and retake Seoul. After 6 weeks of back-and-forth fighting, the US launched a full-scale assault against the North Korean and Chinese forces in February 1951. For the rest of the year, fighting continued around the 38th parallel, steadily degrading into World War I-style trench warfare, brutal and mechanical. As casualties mounted on both sides, efforts at negotiating a ceasefire grew. However, several attempts at diplomacy were thwarted throughout 1952 and into 1953. With Korean civilian casualties approaching 3 million, a proposal was finally accepted by the United Nations, and an armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. The result led the embittered North and South Koreans to create a demilitarized zone roughly along the 38th parallel, which has perpetuated the hostility of the two countries for 6 decades and counting.
Now, I explain non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement emerged in the wake of decolonization that followed World War II. At the Bandung Conference, 1955, the newly independent countries of Asia and Africa gave a call for abstaining from allying with any of the two superpowers. It also pledged to fight all forms of colonialism and imperialism. The NAM held its first conference at Belgrade in 1961 under the leadership of Tito, Yugoslavia, Nasser, Egypt, Nehru, India, Nkrumah, Ghana, Sukarno, Indonesia. The basic principle of non-alignment, as listed in the statement issued at the Belgrade Conference, were peaceful coexistence, commitment to peace and security, no military alliance with any superpower, no permission for any superpower to build its military base in its territories. With the collapse of Soviet Union, the idea of non-alignment lost relevance. Next, I will explain the Cuban Revolution. The United States had its satellite states in Central America, the Caribbean, and East Asia. The states were governed by ruling groups made up of military personnel, landed gentry, and occasionally of local capitalists. After Castro took power, the US owned oil refineries on the island refused to process Russian oil. Castro nationalized them. The US retaliated by ending the agreement by which it bought the bulk of Cuba's sugar. Castro nationalized the US-owned sugar companies and ended the US monopolies in electricity and telephones. All these gravely threatened American economic interest. Cuban Missile Crisis. In April 1961, while landing an army of Cuban exiles on the island of Bay of Pigs, the US bombed Cuban airfield with the objective of overthrowing Castro's regime. US warship surrendered Cuba. The Kennedy government had received intelligence that USSR was secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. Finally, the Soviet President Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles and thus the missile crisis was diffused. Eventually, the two sides reached an agreement. The Soviet Union removed the missiles from Cuba on an understanding that the US would never invade Cuba again. Children, now we are going to end of this session. I hope you are all observing the class properly, isn't it? Well done. Children, you must read 2 times today's topic, Cold War. Okay? Tomorrow I'll ask a few questions from Cold War topic. So read properly. Thank you children. See you next class.